The frozen river stretched before Will Dawson like a sheet of cracked glass, and somewhere beneath its treacherous surface, he could hear the desperate thrashing of someone fighting for their life. Will had been riding his bay gelding along the snow-covered banks of the Little Colorado River near Springerville, Arizona Territory, on that bitter January morning in 1884 when he heard the scream. The sound cut through the howling wind like a knife, high and terrified, and without thinking he spurred his horse toward the noise. The temperature had dropped to brutal lows over the past week, freezing the river solid in most places, but the current ran swift here, and patches of thin ice made the crossing deadly. He dismounted in a blur of motion, his boots crunching through the snow as he ran toward the riverbank. That was when he saw her, a young woman with dark auburn hair plastered to her pale face, her hands clawing at the ice edge as the current tried to drag her under. Her lips were already blue, her movements becoming sluggish. "Hold on!" Will shouted, throwing off his heavy coat even as the cold bit into him through his flannel shirt. He grabbed his rope from the saddle and quickly tied one end around a sturdy cottonwood tree, the other around his waist. There was no time to think, no time to consider the risk. The woman's head dipped below the surface, then came back up with a gasp. Will stepped onto the ice, testing each footfall. The surface creaked ominously beneath his weight. He was a tall man, solid and strong from years of working cattle, but that meant he was also heavy. The ice groaned. He kept moving, dropping to his hands and knees to distribute his weight as he got closer to where she struggled. "I'm coming. Just keep your head up." His voice was steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The woman's terrified eyes met his, and he saw the moment she understood someone was trying to help. She stopped thrashing, which was good. The panic would kill her faster than the cold if she wore herself out. Will crawled closer, the rope tight around his waist. He was 10 feet away. Then 5. The ice beneath him cracked, and he heard its spiderweb outward. He did not stop. "Give me your hand." He reached out, stretching as far as he could. Their fingers brushed, then caught. Her hand was so cold it felt like touching stone, but he gripped hard and pulled. The ice gave way beneath him with a sound like breaking china, and suddenly he was in the water too. The cold was a shock that drove the air from his lungs. It was not just cold, it was pain, immediate and all-consuming. But his hand was still locked around hers, and the rope was still secure. He kicked hard, pulling the woman toward him with one arm while reaching for the rope with the other. "Hold on to me," he gasped. She wrapped her arms around his neck in a death grip, and he could feel her whole body shaking violently. He grabbed the rope with both hands and began to pull them toward the bank, hand over hand, his muscles screaming with the effort. The current fought him, trying to drag them downstream under the ice. Will set his jaw and pulled harder. His hands were going numb. His legs felt like lead. But he kept pulling, inch by inch, until his boots finally found purchase on the rocky bottom. He stood, water streaming from his clothes, and half carried, half dragged the woman onto solid ground. They collapsed together in the snow, both gasping for air. Will's whole body was shaking now, his teeth chattering so hard he could barely speak. "Got to get warm," he managed to say. "Got to move." The woman tried to respond but could only nod. Her lips were beyond blue now, nearly purple. Will forced himself to his feet and pulled her up with him. His horse had stayed nearby, well trained despite the commotion. Will grabbed his coat from where he had thrown it and wrapped it around the woman, then pulled her toward his horse. "Can you ride?" he asked. She nodded again, though he was not sure she really understood the question. He lifted her into the saddle, then climbed up behind her. He wrapped his arms around her to keep her upright and to share what little warmth they had between them, then urged the horse into a gallop. His ranch was 3 miles away, but there was a lined shack just over the next rise, maybe half a mile. It would have to do. The woman slumped against him, and he held her tighter, terrified she would pass out and fall. He talked to her, nonsense mostly, just to keep her conscious. "Stay with me now. We're almost there. You're going to be fine. Just stay awake." The lined shack appeared through the swirling snow like a miracle. Will pulled the horse to a stop and dismounted, then carefully lifted the woman down. She could barely stand. He kicked the door open and brought her inside, then went back for his saddlebag. His hands were shaking so badly he could hardly unbuckle it, but he managed to grab the matches he kept wrapped in oilcloth. The lined shack was small and drafty, but it had a fireplace and a small stack of wood. Will got a fire going, his frozen fingers fumbling with the matches. It took 3 tries before one caught, but then the kindling caught, and flames began to spread. He piled on wood, not caring about conserving it. They needed heat, and they needed it now. The woman had collapsed near the fireplace, still wrapped in his coat. Will knew what had to be done next, and there was no time for modesty. They had to get out of their wet clothes, or they would both die of exposure. "Miss," he said, his voice hoarse, "we need to get these wet things off. You understand? We'll freeze if we don't." She looked at him with glazed eyes and nodded slightly. Her hands moved weakly toward the buttons of her dress, but she could not manage them. Will turned away and stripped off his own soaking shirt and pants, leaving only his long underwear. He found a scratchy wool blanket in the corner and wrapped it around himself, then turned back to her. "I'm going to help you now. Nothing improper, I promise. Just trying to save our lives." He helped her out of the heavy dress, which was frozen stiff in places, and the layers of petticoats beneath. There was another blanket, and he wrapped it around her, averting his eyes as much as possible. Then he moved them both closer to the fire and began to rub her hands and feet, trying to restore circulation. "What's your name?" he asked, as much to assess her mental state as anything. Teresa," she stammered through chattering teeth. "Teresa Carmichael. I'm Will Dawson." "You're going to be all right, Teresa." He kept rubbing her hands, then her feet, which were like ice. Gradually, painfully, color began to return to them. She gasped as feeling came back, and he knew it hurt. Frostbite recovery was agonizing, but pain meant the tissue was still alive. "What were you doing out there?" he asked gently. Teresa's eyes filled with tears. "Running," she whispered. "I was running." Will did not press her further. He could see the fear in her eyes, the way she flinched slightly when he moved too quickly. Someone or something had scared her badly enough to risk crossing that river in the dead of winter. That was a story for later, when they were both warm and safe. He found his spare clothes in the saddlebag and dressed, then hung their wet things near the fire. The flames were strong now, filling the small space with warmth. Will pulled the blankets and his coat into a makeshift bed near the hearth and helped Teresa settle onto it. "Rest now," he said. "I'll keep the fire going," but Teresa's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. "Don't leave," she said, her eyes wide with panic. "I'm not going anywhere," Will assured her. He sat down beside her, his back against the stone fireplace. "I'll be right here." She relaxed slightly but did not let go of his wrist. Eventually, her grip loosened as exhaustion overtook her, and she fell into a fitful sleep. Will stayed awake, feeding the fire and watching over her. The storm outside intensified, wind howling around the corners of the shack, snow piling against the door. He studied her face in the firelight. She was young, probably around 20 or so, with fine features and that striking dark auburn hair. There was a bruise on her cheekbone that he had not noticed before, yellowing now but clearly a few days old. Anger stirred in his chest. He had seen that kind of mark before. Will himself was 26, old enough to have seen his share of hard times. He had been working cattle since he was 14, saved every penny, and finally bought his own small spread 2 years ago. It was not much, just 160 acres with a cabin and a barn, but it was his. He had been on his way back from checking his herd when he heard Teresa's scream. The night wore on. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and Will knew they would be stuck here until morning at least. He did not mind. The important thing was that they were both alive. He had pulled people from dangerous situations before, but never from a frozen river. The memory of that ice-cold water made him shiver even now, warm and dry beside the fire. Dawn came gray and cold, light filtering through the cracks in the shack's walls. Teresa stirred, her eyes opening slowly. For a moment she looked confused, then frightened, then she saw Will and seemed to remember. "You saved my life," she said, her voice raspy. "You would have done the same," Will replied, though he was not entirely sure that was true. Not many people would have risked going into that river. Teresa sat up slowly, keeping the blanket wrapped around herself. "My clothes, still drying, but they should be wearable soon. Storm's past, looks like. We can head to my place once you're ready, get you properly warm and fed." She nodded, then looked down at her hands. "He'll be looking for me." "Who?" Will asked, though he thought he knew. "My stepfather, Martin Cooper." She said the name like it tasted bitter. "He's going to be very angry." "Did he do that?" Will gestured to the bruise on her face. Teresa touched it unconsciously. "Yes, among other things. He wanted me to marry his business partner, a man nearly 60 years old. I refused. So he locked me in my room. I climbed out the window last night during the storm. I thought if I could cross the river, I could get to the mission in San Carlos, find sanctuary there. But the ice broke." Will felt that anger stirring again, hotter this time. "You don't have to go back to him." "I have nowhere else to go. My mother died 3 years ago. I have no other family." "You can stay at my ranch while we figure something out," Will said. "I have a spare room. My housekeeper, Mrs. Garcia, lives in town but comes out most days. She'll chaperone proper-like." Teresa looked at him with surprise and something else, hope maybe. "You would do that? You don't even know me." "I know you were willing to risk a frozen river to escape. That tells me plenty about what you were running from." Will stood and checked their clothes. The heavy fabrics were still damp but would do. Besides, can't very well pull someone from a river and then send them back to the person who drove them there in the first place. He turned his back while Teresa dressed, then put on his own things. The clothes were uncomfortable, still slightly damp and cold, but they would warm up once they started moving. Will opened the door to brilliant white. Snow had piled up during the night, but the sky was clear now, and the sun was already working to melt the fresh powder. He brought his horse around and helped Teresa mount, then climbed up behind her. The ride to his ranch took nearly an hour through the snow, but the horse was strong and sure-footed. Teresa was quiet, but she did not seem afraid anymore. She leaned back against Will's chest, accepting his steadying arm around her waist. The ranch came into view as they crested the last hill. It was modest, a sturdy log cabin with a stone chimney, a barn, a small corral, and a few outbuildings. But it sat in a pretty little valley with cottonwoods along a creek, and Will had always thought it was the finest place on earth. "It's beautiful," Teresa said softly. "It's home," Will replied, pleased by her reaction. He helped her down and led her into the cabin. The fire had gone out in the main room, but the structure still held some warmth. Will quickly got a new fire blazing while Teresa looked around. The cabin was clean and simply furnished, clearly the home of a man who lived alone but took some pride in his space. "The spare room is through there," Will said, pointing. "It's not much, but the bed is comfortable. You should rest. I need to ride into town and let Mrs. Garcia knows she's needed here, and I should probably talk to the sheriff too." Teresa's face paled. "The sheriff? Why?" "Because you're under my protection now, and Martin Cooper needs to know he cannot come here making trouble." Will's voice was firm. "You're of age, right? Free to make your own choices." "I'm 21, Teresa confirmed. "Then he's got no legal hold on you. The sheriff needs to know the situation in case Cooper tries anything." Teresa nodded slowly. "All right, but what if he does not care what the sheriff says? Then he'll answer to me." Will said it simply, but there was steel in his voice. He left Teresa settled by the fire with a cup of hot coffee and some bread and preserves, then rode into Springerville. The town was small, just a main street with a general store, a saloon, the sheriff's office, a church, and a handful of other buildings. But it was growing, and good people were settling in the area. Sheriff Tom Hendricks was in his office, a grizzled man in his 50s who had kept the peace in Springerville for a decade. He listened to Will's story without interruption, his expression growing more serious, as Will described pulling Teresa from the river and learning about her situation. "Martin Cooper," the sheriff said, leaning back in his chair. "I know him. He's got a freight business, does pretty well for himself. Didn't know he was the type to abuse his stepdaughter, but I guess you never can tell." "He is, and I've got the evidence in the form of one half-frozen young woman currently sitting in my cabin," Will said. "I want it on record that she's there of her own free will, under Mrs. Garcia's supervision, and if Cooper comes around causing trouble, I want you to know why." "Fair enough." The sheriff made some notes. "I'll ride out and have a talk with Cooper this afternoon, let him know the situation. Girls of age, like you said. He's got no claim on her." "Thank you, Sheriff." Will's next stop was the small house where Mrs. Garcia lived with her husband and 3 children. Maria Garcia was a warm, practical woman in her 40s who had been helping Will keep his cabin livable since he bought the place. Her husband, Carlos, worked at the general store and sometimes helped Will with ranch work. When Will explained the situation, Maria immediately began packing a bag. "Poor girl," she said, shaking her head. "Of course I will help. Carlos, tell Mr. Henderson I will not be at the store for a few days." "I'll pay you extra for the trouble," Will said. "Nonsense. You pulled her from a river, Will Dawson. We will help because it is the right thing to do." They rode back to the ranch together, and when they arrived, Will was relieved to see Teresa still sitting by the fire. She looked up anxiously as they entered, then relaxed when she saw Maria. "Teresa, this is Mrs. Garcia. She's going to stay here for a while, help you get settled." Maria went to Teresa immediately, looking her over with a practiced eye. "You poor dear. Come, let me help you to the room. You need proper rest in a proper bed." Teresa rose and let Maria lead her away, but she looked back at Will. "Thank you," she said again, "for everything." "You're safe here," Will replied. "That's all that matters." Over the next few days, a routine developed. Will worked his ranch as he always had, tending to his small herd of cattle, fixing fences and chopping wood. But now he came back to a cabin that felt different. There was life in it beyond his own solitary existence. Maria cooked meals that were far better than anything Will had managed on his own, and Teresa, as she recovered her strength, began to help. Will learned more about her in fragments. She had grown up in Santa Fe, the daughter of a merchant. Her mother had married Martin Cooper when Teresa was 16, a year after her father died. At first, Cooper had seemed decent enough, but after the wedding, his true nature emerged. He was controlling and had a vicious temper. Teresa's mother had protected her as much as possible, but after she died, Teresa had been alone with him. He started talking about marrying me off to his business partner about 6 months ago. Teresa told Will one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Maria was inside preparing dinner. The man's name is Edgar Finch. He's old and mean, and he looks at me like I'm a piece of horseflesh he's considering buying. Cooper owes him money, you see. I was to be payment. Will's hands clenched into fists. That's not going to happen. I know that now, Teresa said softly. Thanks to you. She looked at him, and Will felt something shift in his chest. Over the past few days, he had come to appreciate more than just Teresa's beauty. She was intelligent and surprisingly funny when she felt safe. She asked him questions about ranching with genuine interest, and had started helping with small tasks around the place, despite Maria's protests that she should rest. You ever worked cattle before? Will asked, partly to distract himself from the way the setting sun turned her hair to fire. No, but I'd like to learn. I want to be useful, not just a burden. You're not a burden, Will said firmly, but if you want to learn, I'd be happy to teach you. Teresa smiled, and Will realized it was the first real smile he had seen from her. It transformed her face, made her eyes light up. He found himself smiling back. What about your ranch? She asked. How did you come to own it? So Will told her his own story. He had been orphaned young and raised by an uncle who worked cattle in Texas. He had learned the trade from the ground up, saved every penny he made, and headed west looking for his own piece of land. Arizona territory was still rough in many ways, but it had opportunities for a man willing to work hard. I want to build something that lasts, he said. Expand the herd, maybe buy some more land. Springerville's growing. This territory will be a state someday, and I aim to be part of building it. That's a good dream, Teresa said. What about you? What do you dream about? Teresa was quiet for a long moment. I used to dream about escaping Cooper. That was the extent of my ambitions. Now, I don't know, freedom, I suppose, the chance to make my own choices. You have that now, Will said. Whatever you decide to do, wherever you want to go, you're free to choose. She looked at him searchingly. What if I wanted to stay here? Will's heart skipped. You'd be welcome to stay as long as you like. You could work for wages if you want it proper. I could use the help, and Maria's not getting any younger. She's been saying I need to hire someone permanent. I'd like that, Teresa said. If you mean it. I mean it. True to his word, Sheriff Hendricks had visited Martin Cooper. The sheriff stopped by Will's ranch a week after Teresa's rescue to report on the conversation. He was not happy, Hendricks said, accepting a cup of coffee from Maria. Said the girl was ungrateful and had no right to run off. I reminded him she's 21 years old and can do as she pleases. He threatened to come out here and drag her back. Will's expression hardened. What did you say to that? I told him if he set foot on your property without permission, I'd arrest him for trespassing. Also mentioned that if any harm came to the girl, I'd be looking at him first. The sheriff took a sip of coffee. But I won't lie to you, Will. Cooper's got money and friends. He might try to make trouble through other means. Let him try, Will said. After the sheriff left, Will found Teresa in the barn. She had taken to helping him with the horses, and she had a natural way with them. She was brushing down Will's bay gelding when he entered. I heard what the sheriff said, she said without looking up. I'm causing you nothing but trouble. You're not causing anything. Cooper's the one making trouble, and that's his choice. Will leaned against the stall door. I meant what I said, Teresa. You're safe here and you're welcome here. She stopped brushing and turned to face him. Why? Why would you do all this for a stranger? Will considered the question. Maybe you were a stranger when I pulled you from that river, but you're not anymore. And even if you were, it would not matter. It's the right thing to do. Most people don't do the right thing, not when it costs them something. Then most people are wrong. Teresa stepped closer to him. You're a good man, Will Dawson. I'm just a man, he replied, but he could not look away from her eyes. The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither of them was quite ready to name. Then Maria's voice called from the cabin that dinner was ready, and the spell broke. Winter deepened, and Teresa truly became part of the ranch. She learned to cook, to mend, to help with the animals. Will taught her to ride properly, and she proved to be a natural horsewoman. On clear days, they would ride out together to check on the cattle, and Will found himself looking forward to those rides more than anything else. They talked as they rode about everything and nothing. Teresa had been educated, and she had read books Will had only heard of. She told him stories, and he soaked them up like a man dying of thirst. In turn, he taught her about the land, how to read the weather, how to spot a cow in distress, all the practical knowledge he had accumulated over the years. "You're a good teacher," she told him one afternoon as they sat on a ridge overlooking his valley. "Patient." "You're a good student," he replied, "quick to learn." She looked out over the snow-covered landscape. "I never thought I could be happy in a place like this. I always imagined cities, society, but this is better." "Why's that?" "Because it's real. There's no pretense here. You work hard and the land either provides or it doesn't. There's an honesty to it." She looked at him. "And the company's not bad either." Will felt heat rise in his face despite the cold. "I'm glad you stayed. So am I." As the weeks passed, Will became increasingly aware that his feelings for Teresa were growing beyond simple friendship or protectiveness. He caught himself watching her when she was not looking, memorizing the way she laughed, or the determined set of her jaw when she was learning something new. He looked forward to breakfast because she would be there. He delayed going to bed because that meant not seeing her until morning. It terrified him. Will had never been in love before. He had not had time for it, always too focused on survival, on saving money, on building his future. But now that future felt empty when he imagined it without Teresa in it. He did not know if she felt the same. She was warm toward him, certainly. She smiled when she saw him and seemed to seek out his company. But was that gratitude, friendship, or something more? Maria, perceptive as always, noticed the tension. She cornered Will one morning when Teresa had walked to the creek. "You love her," Maria said. "It was not a question." "I don't know what you're talking about," Will muttered, focusing intently on his coffee. "Please." "You look at her like Carlos looks at fresh baked bread, and she looks at you the same way." Will's head snapped up. "She does," Maria laughed. "Yes, you fool, so what are you waiting for? Tell her." "It's too soon. She just escaped one man trying to control her life. Last thing she needs is another man making demands. Telling someone you love them is not a demand. It's a gift." Maria patted his shoulder. "But you do what you think is right. Just don't wait too long. Life is uncertain." That night, Will lay in bed thinking about Maria's words. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was time to be honest about his feelings. But what if he was wrong? What if Teresa felt nothing more than friendship? He could lose what they had. The easy companionship, the laughter, all of it could become awkward and strained. He was still wrestling with these thoughts when he heard a noise outside. It was subtle, just the soft crunch of footsteps in snow. Will was out of bed instantly, pulling on his pants and grabbing his rifle. It was past midnight. No one should be out there. He moved silently to the window and peered out. In the moonlight, he could see 3 figures on horseback approaching the cabin. His jaw tightened. He recognized the lead horse. It belonged to Martin Cooper. Will moved quickly to Teresa's room and knocked softly. "Teresa, wake up. We've got trouble." She was awake immediately, and there was fear in her eyes when she opened the door. "Is it him?" "Yes, stay inside. I'll handle this." "Will, be careful. He's dangerous." "So am I when I need to be." Will stepped out onto the porch, rifle held casually but ready. The 3 riders had stopped about 20 yards from the cabin. Martin Cooper sat in the middle, a heavy-set man with a florid face and small, mean eyes. The men flanking him looked like hired muscle. "You're on my property," Will said, his voice carrying clearly in the still night. Leave now." "I've come for my stepdaughter," Cooper said. "Send her out. She's not going anywhere with you. The girl is under my care. She's mentally unwell, prone to fits and delusions. I'm taking her home where she can be properly looked after. She's 21 years old and free to make her own choices. The sheriff already told you this. Now get off my land." Cooper's face darkened. "I don't think you understand your situation, boy. I have friends, important friends. I can make your life very difficult. And I have a rifle which makes your situation very simple. Turn around and ride away." One of the men with Cooper moved his hand toward his gun. Will's rifle came up in a smooth motion, aimed directly at Cooper. "I wouldn't," Will said coldly. "I can put a bullet between your eyes before your man clears leather, and we both know it." The cabin door opened behind Will, and Teresa stepped out despite his order to stay inside. "Go away, Martin. You have no power over me anymore." "You ungrateful little wretch," Cooper snarled. "After everything I did for you, I gave you a home, fed you, clothed you. You beat me. You tried to sell me to Edgar Finch like I was livestock. That's not care, that's slavery." "You're coming with me one way or another," Cooper said. "If not tonight, then another night. You cannot hide on this ranch forever." "She's not hiding," Will said. "She's living her life free of you. Now, for the last time, get off my property." Cooper stared at them for a long moment, hatred burning in his eyes. Then he turned his horse. "This is not over," he said, and rode away, his two men following. Will kept the rifle up until they disappeared into the darkness, then finally lowered it. He was shaking slightly, adrenaline coursing through him. Teresa touched his arm. "Thank you again." "He'll be back," Will said grimly. "Or he'll try something else. Men like that don't give up." "Then what do we do?" Will looked at her, at the fear and determination mixed in her face, and made a decision. "You marry me." Teresa blinked. "What, marry me? If you're my wife, he has no claim, legal or otherwise." "It's not the most romantic proposal, I know, but it would solve the problem." "Will, you can't just marry me to solve a problem. That's not a reason to get married." "You're right," Will said, lowering the rifle. His heart was pounding. "But that's not the only reason. Truth is, I love you, Teresa. I think I started falling for you the moment I saw you fighting to stay alive in that river. These past weeks have been the best of my life. And the thought of you leaving, of not seeing you every day, it's unbearable. So yes, marrying you would solve the Cooper problem. But mainly, I want to marry you because I cannot imagine my life without you in it." Teresa stared at him, her mouth slightly open. "You love me." "I do, with everything I am." "Oh, Will." Her eyes filled with tears. "I love you too. I was afraid to say anything because I thought maybe you were just being kind, that you felt obligated because you saved me. Nothing about how I feel is obligation." He set the rifle aside and took her hands. "So, will you marry me? For real, not just to spite Martin Cooper?" "Yes," Teresa said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I'll marry you." Will pulled her into his arms and kissed her, and it felt like coming home. When they finally broke apart, Maria was standing in the doorway in her nightgown, grinning. "It's about time," she said. "Now come inside before you both freeze. We have a wedding to plan." They were married 3 days later in the small church in Springerville. Maria and Carlos stood as witnesses, along with Sheriff Hendricks and his wife. Teresa wore a simple dress that Maria had helped her make, and Will wore his best clothes, his hair slicked back and his boots polished until they shone. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. When the preacher said, "You may kiss your bride," Will did so with a tenderness that made Maria dab at her eyes with her handkerchief. Afterward, they had a small celebration at the ranch. Some of Will's neighbors came, good people who had heard the story and approved of the match. They brought food and well wishes, and for a few hours, the cabin was full of warmth and laughter. As evening fell and the guests departed, Will and Teresa found themselves alone for the first time as husband and wife. There was an awkwardness between them suddenly, the weight of what they had committed to settling in. "I'll sleep in the spare room tonight if you want," Will said quietly. "I know this all happened fast. I don't want you to feel pressured." Teresa took his hand. "Will, I married you because I love you and want to be your wife, in every sense of the word. I'm not afraid of you, I never have been." "You're sure?" "I'm sure." Their wedding night was tender and sweet, and if there was awkwardness, it was the good kind, the kind that comes from two people learning each other for the first time. Will was gentle and patient, and Teresa was brave and trusting, and by morning they felt truly married in every way that mattered. The next few weeks were blissful. Winter began to release its grip on the land, and the snow started to melt. Will and Teresa worked the ranch together, and at night they would lie in bed talking about their dreams for the future. They wanted to expand the herd, maybe build a bigger cabin eventually. Teresa wanted a garden, and Will promised to help her build raised beds come spring. They were careful when going into town, always together and always aware of their surroundings. Will wore his gun now, something he had not done regularly before. He had sent word to Cooper through the sheriff that Teresa was now Mrs. Dawson, and any further harassment would be met with legal action or worse. For a while, it seemed Cooper had backed off. Then, on a cold February morning, Sheriff Hendricks rode out to the ranch with news. "Martin Cooper's left the territory," he said, accepting a cup of coffee from Teresa. "Packed up his whole operation and moved it to California. Seems some of his business dealings came under scrutiny, and he decided a fresh start would be wise." Teresa nearly dropped the coffee pot. "He's gone, really gone, really gone. His partner, Edgar Finch, went with him. Good riddance to both of them, I say." After the sheriff left, Teresa turned to Will with tears streaming down her face. "It's over. I'm really free." Will held her close. "You've been free since the day you climbed out that window. Now everyone else knows it too." With the threat of Cooper removed, life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Spring came, bringing green grass and wildflowers. Teresa planted her garden with Maria's help, and Will worked on expanding his herd. He bought 20 more head of cattle from a rancher who was selling out, a good investment that stretched his savings but would pay off in time. Teresa proved to be an invaluable partner. She had a head for numbers and helped Will keep his accounts in order. She learned to rope and brand, to treat sick animals, and to read the moods of the cattle. The neighboring ranchers, initially skeptical of a woman doing ranch work, came to respect her skill and determination. "You've got yourself quite a wife there, Dawson," old Tom Patterson said one day when he stopped by to borrow some tack. "Woman who can work like a man but still looks like a lady. That's a rare thing." "I know how lucky I am," Will replied, watching Teresa expertly separate a cow from the herd to check a healing injury. That summer brought its own challenges. A drought threatened the territory, and water became scarce. Will had to move his herd to higher ground where a creek still ran, camping out there for weeks at a time. Teresa insisted on coming with him, refusing to stay at the ranch alone. "We're partners," she said firmly. "That means we face the hard times together." So they camped under the stars, cooking over an open fire and sleeping in a tent. It was hard work, but there were moments of pure joy too. Lying together watching the Milky Way spread across the sky, listening to the cattle settle for the night, sharing quiet conversations in the darkness. Will thought he had never been happier, despite the difficulties. The rains finally came in August, breaking the drought. The land turned green almost overnight, and the creek swelled back to its normal size. They moved the herd back down to the main pasture, and life returned to normal. In September, Teresa began to feel unwell. At first, she thought it was just fatigue from the hard summer, but when the nausea started, Maria took one look at her and smiled knowingly. "You're with child," Maria said. "Congratulations." Teresa was nervous and excited in equal measure. She told Will that evening, watching his face carefully for his reaction. Would he be happy? Worried? They had not planned this, though they had not exactly been preventing it either. Will's face lit up like sunrise. "A baby? We're having a baby." "Yes. Are you happy?" "Happy." "Teresa, I'm over the moon." He picked her up and spun her around, then set her down quickly. "Sorry, should I not do that? I don't want to hurt the baby." Teresa laughed. "The baby's fine. I'm fine. We're all fine." Will placed his hand on her still flat stomach with wonder. "We made a life." "You and me." "We did." That winter was different from the last. Instead of fighting cold and fear, they were preparing for a new arrival. Will worked on converting the spare room into a nursery, building a cradle from oak and sanding it until it was smooth as glass. Teresa sewed baby clothes with Maria's help, tiny gowns and blankets that seemed impossibly small. "Are we ready for this?" Teresa asked one night, looking at the cradle. "To be parents, probably not," Will admitted. "But we'll figure it out together, same as everything else." Their son was born on a warm May morning in 1885, after a labor that lasted through the night. Doc Harrison came from town to assist, and Maria was there to help. Will paced outside, wearing a path in the dirt, until he finally heard the cry of a newborn. Maria appeared in the doorway, grinning. "You have a son, a healthy, loud son." Will rushed inside to find Teresa lying in bed, exhausted but glowing, holding a tiny bundle. "Meet your son," she said softly. Will approached carefully, almost afraid to touch something so small and precious. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and his eyes were scrunched shut as he wailed his displeasure at the world. "He's perfect," Will breathed. "You're perfect. I can't believe he's ours." "What should we name him?" Teresa asked. They had discussed names but never settled on one. Now, looking at his son, Will knew. "James, after your father, James Daniel Dawson." Teresa's eyes filled with tears. "You remembered." "Of course I remembered. You told me he was a good man, an honest merchant. I'd be honored to have our son carry his name." "James," Teresa whispered to the baby. "Your name is James." The baby stopped crying, as if acknowledging his name, and Will laughed with pure joy. The first year of James's life was a blur of sleepless nights and steep learning curves. Will discovered that ranching was easy compared to changing diapers and soothing a colicky baby at 3 in the morning. But he also discovered depths of love he had not known existed. The first time James smiled at him, Will felt his heart might burst. The first time the baby wrapped his tiny hand around Will's finger, he understood what it meant to be utterly devoted to another person. Teresa adapted to motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything else. She was patient and loving, but she also insisted on maintaining some independence. As soon as James was old enough, she fashioned a sling that let her carry him while she worked, tending the garden with the baby strapped to her chest. "You should be resting," Maria scolded. "I've rested enough." "I'm not made of glass." Will learn not to argue with his wife when she had that tone in her voice. Besides, he admired her strength and her refusal to be limited by motherhood. She was not just a wife or a mother. She was Teresa, a woman of many parts, and he loved all of them. When James was 2 years old, Teresa became pregnant again. This time she knew the signs immediately and was less anxious about it. The pregnancy was easier than the first, and in the spring of 1887, she gave birth to a daughter they named Mary Catherine Dawson, after Will's mother. "Now we have one of each," Teresa said, cradling their daughter while James peeked curiously at his new sister from Will's arms. "Is that enough?" Will asked with a smile. "Ask me again in a year," Teresa replied, and they both laughed. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Will's hard work and careful management paid off, and he was able to buy an adjoining piece of land, expanding his spread to over 300 acres. They built a new, larger cabin, with proper rooms for the children and a big kitchen for Teresa. It was not a mansion by any means, but it was solidly built and comfortable. A real home. Springerville was growing too. Arizona territory was changing, becoming more civilized. Statehood seemed like a real possibility now rather than a distant dream. Will served on the town council, helping to make decisions about schools and roads. Teresa started a ladies' auxiliary that worked to help new settlers get established, drawing on her own experience of arriving with nothing. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and growth. James grew into a sturdy boy who loved horses and helping his father with the cattle. Mary was quieter, more bookish, but she had her mother's determination. In 1890, Teresa gave birth to another son, whom they named Thomas, and 2 years after that, twin girls arrived, surprising everyone. They named them Sarah and Ruth. 5 children, Will said, looking at his brood gathered around the dinner table one evening. "When did we become such a big family?" "Gradually, then suddenly," Teresa replied with a smile, "and I wouldn't change a thing." Will reached across the table and took her hand. After 10 years of marriage, the simple gesture still made his heart skip. Neither would I. They had their hard times, of course. There was the year a harsh winter killed a quarter of their herd. The year Mary nearly died from scarlet fever, and they took turns sitting up with her for 5 straight nights until the fever finally broke. The year a wildfire swept through the territory and they had to dig fire breaks to save their land. But there were far more good times. Watching James learn to rope, teaching Mary to read, Thomas taking his first steps right into Will's arms, the twins' infectious laughter as they chased chickens around the yard, family dinners that were loud and chaotic and full of love, Christmas mornings with the children's excited voices, summer evenings on the porch with Teresa's hand in his and the sounds of their children playing in the yard. In 1895, something happened that brought the past rushing back. Will was in town picking up supplies when he overheard 2 men talking. "Did you hear Martin Cooper died? The freight company owner who used to operate out of Springerville?" "No. How'd he go?" "Heart attack, from what I heard. In Sacramento. His whole empire collapsed after he left here. Turns out he was running all kinds of shady deals, died broke and alone." Will felt nothing but a distant pity. Cooper had tried to control Teresa through fear and violence, and in the end, he had died with nothing. Meanwhile, Teresa was surrounded by love and family. Justice, Will supposed, came in many forms. He told Teresa about it when he got home. She was quiet for a moment, processing the news. "I should feel something," she finally said. "Relief, maybe, or vindication, but I just feel sorry for him. What a waste of a life." "You're a better person than he ever was," Will said. "No, I'm just a lucky person. Lucky that I ran that night, lucky that the ice broke where it did, lucky that you heard me scream. If any of those things had been different, I'd have had a very different life." "I'm the lucky one," Will countered. "That frozen river didn't just give me you, it gave me everything that matters. Our children, this life we built, all of it started that morning." Teresa kissed him softly. "Then we're both lucky." The territory finally achieved statehood in 1912. Will was 60 years old by then, still working the ranch but letting James handle more of the day-to-day operations. Teresa was 51, her auburn hair now streaked with gray but her eyes as bright as ever. They watched the celebration in Springerville with their grown children and their grandchildren, proud to have been part of building something that would last. "We've lived through remarkable times," Teresa said, watching the fireworks explode over the town. "We have," Will agreed. "And we're not done yet." He was right. They had many more years together, watching their children grow and establish their own lives. James took over the ranch and expanded it further, proving to be as capable as his father. Mary became a teacher, educating the next generation of Arizona's children. Thomas started a successful freight business, carrying goods throughout the state. The twins both married local men and settled in Springerville, staying close to their parents. Will and Teresa moved into a smaller house in town in their later years, leaving the ranch to James. But they visited often, and Will never lost his love for the land. He would sit on the porch of the ranch house, watching the cattle graze, and remember the scared young man he had been at 26, thinking his life would be nothing but hard work and solitude. "What are you thinking about?" Teresa would ask, sitting beside him. "How everything changed the day I heard you scream. How one moment can redirect an entire life." "My life didn't just change that day," Teresa would say. "It began. The life before was just existing. This, with you, has been living." Will died peacefully in his sleep in 1932 at the age of 70. He was surrounded by his family, and his last words were to Teresa, telling her he loved her. Teresa held his hand as he slipped away, then kissed his forehead and closed his eyes. "Rest now, my love," she whispered. "You've earned it." Teresa lived another 6 years, spending her time with her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She told them stories about their grandfather, about how he had pulled her from a frozen river and warmed her heart for the rest of his life. About how he had been brave and kind and good, and how he had built a legacy not just of land and cattle, but of love and family. She died in 1938 at the age of 77 and was buried beside Will in the Springerville Cemetery. Their children placed a single headstone for both of them, with an inscription they all agreed on: Will and Teresa Dawson. Together, they built a life worth living. The ranch remained in the family for generations after that, passed down from parent to child, a testament to what two people could create when they worked together. The story of how Will and Teresa met became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. And always, when the story was told, it began the same way, with Will riding along the banks of the Little Colorado on a bitter January morning in 1884, when a scream cut through the wind and changed two lives forever. He had pulled a drowning woman from a frozen river, never knowing that in saving her life, he was also saving his own. Because Teresa had been right when she said that moment was when her life truly began. But it had also been the beginning of Will's real life. Before her, he had been surviving, working toward a future that would have been empty of the things that really mattered. She had filled that future with love and laughter, with children and purpose, with all the small and large joys that make a life complete. The frozen river had tried to take her, but Will had refused to let it. In return, she had given him everything. She had taken his lonely existence and transformed it into a grand adventure filled with meaning. She had warmed his heart that first day by the fire in the line shack, and she had kept it warm through 50 years of marriage, through good times and hard times, through all the seasons of their lives together. Their great-great-grandchildren would eventually sell the ranch, but they kept the homestead, the original cabin that Will had built and where he had brought Teresa as his bride. They restored it and preserved it, turning it into a family gathering place. And every summer, the descendants of Will and Teresa Dawson would come from all over to spend time there, to reconnect with their roots, to remember where they came from. And if you visit that cabin on a quiet morning, when the mist rises from the creek and the sun breaks over the eastern hills, you can almost see them. A tall cowboy and his auburn-haired wife, riding out to check the cattle, their laughter carried on the wind. Partners in every sense of the word. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful that would outlast them both. The frozen river had tried to be the end of Teresa's story. Instead, it had been the beginning of theirs, a beginning that led to a lifetime of love and a legacy that would endure for generations. Will had saved her life that January morning, but as Teresa always said, she had saved his too, in all the ways that really mattered. They had lived fully, loved deeply, and left the world better than they found it. Their family continued to thrive, carrying forward the values that Will and Teresa had instilled, the importance of hard work, integrity, compassion, and above all, love. The ranch land, even though no longer owned by the family, still bore the marks of their stewardship. The irrigation channels Will had dug, the windbreaks Teresa had planted, the strong fences and sturdy buildings that had weathered decades of Arizona sun and storms. In the Springerville Historical Society, there is a photograph of Will and Teresa, taken on their 50th wedding anniversary in 1934. They sit on the porch of their townhouse, hands clasped, looking at each other rather than at the camera. You can see everything in that photograph, the years they shared, the struggles they overcame, the love that never dimmed. Will's hair is white, but his eyes are still sharp and kind. Teresa's face is lined but beautiful, radiant with contentment. Below the photograph is a placard that tells their story in brief, how they met, how they built their ranch, how they raised their family and contributed to their community. But the placard cannot capture the full truth of what they meant to each other. How a moment of desperate courage on a frozen January morning created a bond that death itself could not break. The children they raised went on to raise good children of their own, passing down not just the story of their grandparents' meeting but the lessons of their grandparents' lives. James taught his own children the value of honest work and stewardship of the land. Mary taught hers the importance of education and service. Thomas taught his the meaning of integrity in business. The twins taught theirs about community and family bonds. And all of them, in their own ways, taught about love, showing their children what a true partnership looked like by pointing to the example of Will and Teresa. The land that Will and Teresa worked so hard to build upon changed over the decades. Springerville grew from a small frontier town into a proper city. The dirt roads they traveled became paved highways. The telegraph lines gave way to telephone poles, then radio towers, then television antennas, and eventually cellular towers. The world modernized around the places they had known, but some things remained constant. The little Colorado River still flowed, though it was never quite as cold as it had been that winter of 1884. The valley where their ranch nestled still turned green every spring. The mountains on the horizon still stood in silent witness, and the land still required hard work and respect from those who worked it, just as it had in Will and Teresa's time. In later years, some of Will and Teresa's descendants became curious about Martin Cooper, the man who had driven Teresa to risk everything on that frozen river. Research revealed a sad and sordid tale. Cooper had indeed fled to California with embezzled money, but his business ventures there had failed one after another. He had alienated everyone around him with his temper and dishonesty. Edgar Finch, his partner and the man he had tried to force Teresa to marry, had eventually sued him and won, taking what little Cooper had left. Cooper had died alone in a boarding house, unmourned and unmissed. It was a stark contrast to Will and Teresa's end, surrounded by family, remembered with love, their legacy living on in the lives they had touched. It served as a reminder that how we treat others, the choices we make, these things matter. They echo forward through time. Young couples in the family, just starting out, would often ask for advice about marriage, about building a life together. The older generation would tell them, "Remember Will and Teresa. They started with nothing but each other. They faced hardships and uncertainty. But they stayed true to each other and worked as partners. That's the secret. Love, yes, but also partnership, respect, trust, working together toward common goals." And those young couples would take that advice to heart, knowing it came from a source of deep wisdom, from a relationship that had proven itself over half a century, and left ripples that extended far beyond the lives of just two people. The original homestead cabin, preserved and maintained, became the site of several family weddings over the years. There was something special about starting a marriage in the place where Will and Teresa had started theirs, under the same wide Arizona sky, with the same mountains standing witness. Couples would pose for photographs on the same porch where Will had proposed, standing where two people had once stood and decided to build a future together, despite all the obstacles in their way. Some family members claimed the cabin held a special energy, that you could feel the love that had lived there. Whether that was true or just the power of knowing the story, it did not really matter. What mattered was that the place existed, a tangible connection to the past, a reminder of where they all came from. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the world changed in ways Will and Teresa could never have imagined. But the fundamentals of human experience remained the same. People still fell in love. They still struggled and dreamed and worked to build lives worth living. They still needed examples of how to do it right. And in that, Will and Teresa's story remained relevant, generation after generation. Because it was not just a story about the Wild West or frontier life, though it was certainly that. It was a story about courage, both the obvious courage of diving into a frozen river to save a stranger and the quieter courage of choosing to trust again after being hurt, of opening your heart to love despite the risks. It was a story about how the worst moments can lead to the best outcomes, how a young woman's desperate flight from abuse led her directly to the man who would love and cherish her for the rest of his life. How a lonely cowboy's act of heroism brought him not just a wife, but a true partner, someone who would share his life and his dreams, who would work beside him and love him through every season. It was a story about redemption and transformation, about two people who came together as damaged and incomplete individuals and helped each other become whole. Teresa was not just the woman Will rescued. She was the woman who made his house a home, who turned his solitary existence into a rich family life, who gave him children and grandchildren, and a reason to build something that would outlast him. And Will was not just Teresa's rescuer. He was her partner, her lover, her friend, the father of her children, the steady presence who made her feel safe enough to blossom into everything she could be. Together, they were more than the sum of their parts. Their story was proof that love could conquer, not in some fairy tale way where everything was easy, but in the real way where two people committed to each other and worked through the hard parts, where they chose each other again and again, day after day, year after year. The frozen river that almost took Teresa's life became, in the family's collective memory, a symbol of transformation. Ice and death giving way to life and warmth. Isolation giving way to connection. Fear giving way to love. It was poetic in a way that made the story irresistible. The kind of story that gets told and retold because it captures something essential about the human experience. And so the story lived on, passed down through the generations, embellished perhaps in small ways but true in all the ways that mattered. It lived on in the genes of their descendants, in the values they passed down, in the land they had worked, in the town they had helped build, in the photograph hanging in the historical society, and in the weathered headstone in the cemetery where they rested side by side, Will and Teresa Dawson. Together, they built a life worth living. And in doing so, they created something immortal, not just children and grandchildren, though certainly those, but also an example, a story, a legacy of love that would warm hearts for as long as there were people to tell the tale. The frozen river had tried to take her, but Will would not let it. And because of that single moment of courage on a January morning in 1884, countless lives were touched, countless hearts were warmed, countless people were inspired to be better, to love harder, to work together, to build something lasting. That was the true miracle of their story. Not just that he saved her from drowning, but that together they created something that would never die. Their love story became eternal, a bright thread woven into the fabric of their family's history, connecting past to present to future. And if love is the thing that makes us human, the thing that gives life meaning, then Will and Teresa's life together was a masterpiece of humanity. It was messy and hard sometimes, because all real life is, but it was also beautiful and true and worth every struggle. They had lived and they had loved, and they had left the world richer for their presence in it. What more could anyone ask from a life? What better legacy could anyone leave? The story of the cowboy and the frozen river was, in the end, a story about hope. Hope that in our darkest moments, help might come. Hope that brave and good people still exist in the world. Hope that love is possible, even when circumstances seem impossible. Hope that we can rise above our pasts and build better futures. Hope that partnership and commitment and daily choice can create something stronger than romance alone. Hope that a life well lived matters, that it ripples outward in ways we cannot always see, but that endure nonetheless. Will and Teresa gave that hope to their children, and their children gave it to their children, and so on down through the years. And anyone who heard their story received a piece of that hope too. It was a gift that kept on giving generation after generation, a light in the darkness, a warmth in the cold, a reminder that love can save us in more ways than one. The frozen river warmed by love, the lonely heart filled with joy, the frightened girl becoming a strong woman, the solitary man becoming a devoted husband and father, fear transformed into courage, desperation transformed into hope, two incomplete people becoming one strong partnership. This was the story of Will and Teresa Dawson, and it was a story that deserved to be told and remembered. Not because it was perfect, because it was not, but because it was real, because it happened. Because two people actually lived this love story in all its messy, beautiful, difficult, wonderful reality. And in the end, is that not what we all want? To be remembered with love. To have our story told. To know that our lives mattered, that we made a difference, that we loved and were loved in return. Will and Teresa had all of that. They built it together, one day at a time, starting from a frozen river in January 1884 and extending through 50 years of shared life. They kept each other warm in all the ways that matter for the rest of their lives. And the warmth of their love continued to radiate outward long after they were gone, touching everyone who heard their story and everyone who carried their blood, a legacy of love that would never grow cold.